So I'm just going to run this a bit quick here. Now let's talk about the difference in default and dedicated beers. Now, as we said, the default bearer is the first bearer created on the PDN connectivity service. And the PDN connectivity service, as we mentioned before, is the connection between user equipment to the internet. As the user can have more than one PDN connectivity service. So if he's going to the internet, that's one. If he's going to IMS, that's another one. So for each connectivity service, there should be at least one bearer. And this one bearer, I call it the default bearer. So the first bearer created for any PDN connectivity service is called default bearer. And any PDN connectivity service has at least one bearer. And this bearer is the default bearer because it is the first one created, so it normally is the default bearer. But if this PDN, or let me rephrase the part, the basic connectivity of the default bearer is from UE to E node B to S gateway, to PDN gateway, and then goes to the IMS network. The default bearer is always allocated a dynamic IP address in which the user takes from the APN he wants to connect on. So any default bearer has a dynamic IP address that is taken from the APN on the P gateway. And any default bearer has a specific quality profile in which it decides to disperse the packets that are sent on this default bearer, their delay, for example, and the percentage of packet loss, how much is it? The priority of sending these packets as well. So all of this is determined by the quality of service profile, which I put on the default bearer. So any default bearer has a specific quality profile and has an IP address taken from the APN that I will connect on. So these are the parameters, or what's actually found in the default bearer. Now, this default bearer is equivalent to the primary PDP context, which is available in 2G and 3G in packet switching. So I can transfer the user data in 2G and 3G with external packet data network as well. And of course, to avoid any confusion, this bearer has both dynamic and static PDP addresses. Any bearer has an identity or a number. So for example, the default bearer, I'll give it an APS ID number 5. So I will call this EPS bearer ID. So any bearer has a number for its identity only. Let's say that I have a requirement because I have to send packets with a different quality of service than in the default bearer. So I have to create or establish a new bearer. And this new bearer, I'll call it the dedicated bearer. So if I create more than one bearer in one PDN connectivity service, the other bearer that I will create is called the dedicated bearer. This dedicated bearer will share the same IP address it took from the default bearer, in which this person took from the internet or IMS APN. Let's say IP address 1.1.1.1, for example. So the default bearer will take the same IP address 1.1.1.1, and since they are the same PDN connectivity service, as they are both going to the IMS, so they are on the same IMS APN. So the default bearer will be on the same IMS APN, and the dedicated bearer will also be on the same IMS APN. So I give them the same APN or access point name. So it will have an EPS bearer ID. One will have number 5, let's say for the default bearer, and the other will have EPS bearer ID number 6, for example. The dedicated bearer will have a quality of service different from the default bearer, because if they had the same quality of service, then there is no need to do this dedicated bearer. Why would I do a dedicated bearer? It's that because I want to send or move packets which have a quality of service different than the quality of service of the default bearer. Meaning, now let's repeat the question again. Why would I do a dedicated bearer? It's that I want to send or move packets which have a quality of service different than the quality of service of the default bearer. Meaning that the packets that I'll send may be delay sensitive, and the ones that I send in the default bearer are not delay sensitive. So if I send packets on the default bearer, let's say, so if I send packets on the default bearer, if there's any delay, it's fine, or normal. But if there's any delay in the dedicated bearer, then no. I want to send packets that have no delay. That's the idea of the quality of service profile. So the dedicated bearer, the quality of service of its profile is different than the quality of service profile of the default bearer. The network also on the same PDN connectivity service. I can create or move them like a dedicated bearer. It's not a must to create only one dedicated bearer, depending on how the packets I send look like. You'll always find that the dedicated bearer has something called the LPI 5, in which the LPI is an abbreviation for Link Bearer ID. It has the same ID of the EPS bearer ID of the default bearer. This means that this dedicated bearer is linked with the default bearer. So, for example, if I'm moving signaling on the default bearer, let's say the signaling that happens before a call, and the default bearer had a malfunction or a problem, so what will happen here? Any bearer linked with the default bearer will drop or malfunction as well. So the dedicated bearer, for example, I'm moving the speech traffic itself. So since it's linked with a default bearer, so this dedicated bearer won't work or function. But what if we swapped or changed sides and said that the dedicated bearer dropped or malfunctioned? Will the default bearer drop or have any changes? No. And why? Because the default bearer isn't linked with the dedicated bearer. And in normal cases or in a normal IP, you look from our example side, I move the speech traffic on the dedicated beer and the IMS signaling on the default beer. But what if IMS signaling drops general? Will the dedicated beer or speech traffic be able to move or work? So I'm making a call for two people, and this call will move by the dedicated beer. The packets of the call will move on the dedicated beer, but let's say these two people couldn't do signaling or call setup. How were the call even established? So the dedicated beer is always linked with the default beer by this link beer ID, which is found in the dedicated beer. Now, someone may ask, how will the user be able to send this specific traffic on the default beer? And there are other traffic packets he wants to send on dedicated beer. So how will it differentiate? As I have the traffic that is sensitive to delay and other traffic unsensitive to delay. So how will I know this traffic? How will I know to send the voice traffic? Let's say for Skype on the dedicated beer and send the browsing traffic on default beer. How will I do this or differentiate it? Let me tell you. This is something we'll explain called the traffic flow templates, in which the function of the traffic flow templates is to filter this traffic or to look at all of this traffic and what quality of service profile they need, and by its need, it will move it to the beer that can work with it. We agreed that the difference between one beer and the other is the quality of service profile. So the traffic flow templates will tell me where this traffic will go. Will it go to beer number 1, or beer number 2, or beer number 3? We will also see an example shortly on this traffic flow template.